Hello and welcome to this Serial Geek TV episode commentary for The Education of a Superhero, an episode of Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends produced by Marvel Productions. I distinctly remember watching this episode when I was a kid, and I can tell you that I first saw this episode on Children's BBC on December the 9th, 1985, at the height of my comic book buying. Because, I'm about to sound like an old man, when I was a kid, in 1985, you could buy 4 comic books for £1. A few years earlier, you could actually buy 5 comic books for £1. The irony is that as much as I loved this cartoon, I wasn't a fan of the Spider-Man comic books. In 1985, I was obsessed with the Mighty Thor, the Incredible Hulk, and the Avengers, and I would pick up other random comics in the years that followed, like X-Factor and West Coast Avengers. I was a huge fan of X-Factor. Another reason I strongly recall seeing this episode the first time around is that I loved the transformation of Francis Bite into Video Man, but I'll come back to that when we get there. So yeah, as we see in the title card, in this episode, Video Man returns. You know, the villain from 2 previous episodes who, in this episode, everyone seems to have forgotten about. Yeah, it's kind of odd, especially as he was such a memorable guest villain. This arcade that we're in, the establishing shot seems to indicate that the video game hall is actually situated on the university campus. Surely not. Given the addictive nature of video games, I find it hard to believe that any university would do this. Also, in another establishing shot, we see some of the video game titles, including Flogger, nice, and Indiana Johnson. Also, Zam Man, XAM-MAN, is present. Now, for those that don't know, Zam were a team of artists located outside of Los Angeles that Marvel Productions would outsource certain production elements to, such as layouts and backgrounds. Hence why sometimes you see Zam pop up as graffiti in the background of shots of Marvel Productions cartoons. And speaking of visuals, this is one of those episodes that I really wish Toei Doga had animated. Don't get me wrong, Mihan do an admirable job with this episode, but as we saw in the Origin of the Iceman episode, in which Video Man appeared, Toei Doga certainly knew how to animate the character with great fluidity and, when required, explosiveness. And yeah, we've met Francis Bite, the stereotypical nerd. Then again, we've also just seen Flash Thompson, a stereotypical jock. Actually, I have a rather unique experience with Flash Thompson. When I started reading Spider-Man comics, it was the late 80s and early 90s. At that point, Flash Thompson was now friends with Peter Parker, so I never really encountered that bullying version of the character that is prevalent in so many canons. Actually, when I was reading the comics, Flash Thompson was dating Felicia Hardy, completely unaware that she was the Black Cat. And here we have the Gamesman, voiced by Pat Fraley. I'll be honest though, I cannot stand this character. I mean, what is even going on with that costume? It looks like he crudely painted that G on his chest. To those that love to poke fun at this show, characters like this make it an easy target. On the plus side, he is given a perfect voice by the legendary Pat Fraley, whom I've covered a lot on this channel, because he voiced so many characters in so many different shows. I think Pat Fraley is right up there with Frank Welker with regards to talent and versatility. Our guest voice actors for this episode are the always terrific Susan Blue as Louise and David Landsberg as Francis Bite and Video Man. For the longest time, I thought that Francis Bite was voiced by Michael Horton, the voice of Rick Jones on The Incredible Hulk and Chip Chase on The Transformers. A while back, I acquired some original voice reels for the show, so you can imagine I was shocked to learn that it wasn't Michael Horton.
Wow, that's correct! I don't believe it!
So, when we first encountered Video Man in the series, he was created by Electro, the classic Spider-Man villain. For those of you that have seen that episode, Electro's costume is odd due to it being blue and yellow rather than the far more familiar green and yellow of the comic books. That aside, I really do wish they had brought back Electro for this episode, though I probably would have replaced the crazily talented Alan Melvin who voiced Electro the first time around with a less gruff voice. John Stevenson would have made for a good Electro, using a similar voice to the one he used for Loki in the series. Also, just the name, the Gamesman, which is a villainous name used in many a cartoon of the 1980s. Can a name be a trope? The Gamesman here states that more than 200,000 people are now under his control. Were there really that many arcades in New York in 1981? Maybe I'm off base here, let's do the math. So let's say there are at least 50 video games in a single arcade with 50 people playing, which is already a stretch. 200,000 divided by 50, that's 4,000 arcade joints. And even if we said that there were 100 video games in a single arcade, that would still be 2,000 arcades required. What the heck? And Francis Byte is dead. I mean, he should be, but this is just one of those origin stories that makes absolutely no sense, but I'm kind of okay with it. Of course an exploding arcade machine would transform the player into a giant video game sprite. The previous shots of the people emerging from the arcade en masse is really good, in the sense that the director does a great job of making it very eerie. The beep-bop music, the lack of noise, just people zombie-like walking, it really does sell the achievement of mind control really well. This bit is rather interesting, as Spider-Man does not recognise Video Man or even remotely comment that Francis Byte reminds him of someone he fought before. It may be that the script called for a different kind of look to Video Man, or more likely they just decided to retcon what had come before. I love that Video Man, much like a video game of that era, shoots out giant pixels which pack quite a wallop, and yes, we get to see how Video Man travels, which does play into one of my favourite gags later in the episode. We'll get there. And now Francis is home and David Landsberg performs a terrific yell. Get ready for it.
I'm in my own room.
I always love that yell of utter disbelief. I should point out how well Meehan animate Video Man. He's like a paper thin sprite, and so he bends in certain ways but always maintains a certain flatness to him. There's a weird edit coming up here. Francis runs to the mirror and says, "I think I'm going to be sick," but the word sick is cut short.
I think I'm going to be sick.
Which actually makes the edit even funnier, but also maybe this was an error when the episode was cut together. Very strange. Now, I'll be honest, I've seen far better depictions of Central Park on TV animation, and seriously, does that look like 200,000 people to you? It barely even looks like 200 people. I still don't buy that 200,000 number. Going back to Video Man and briefly talking about the character, he was created to reflect the video game boom of the 80s, especially the early to mid 80s. Many cartoons around this time featured a video game related or inspired episode. Even He-Man and the Masters of the Universe had a video game episode with Game Plan. It's incredibly hard to explain to people that weren't around just how impactful video games were back then. So new, so many new ideas, some succeeding, some failing. It was a wonderful time to wander into an arcade and see what new games with crazy concepts had just come out. Now, I mentioned at the start of this episode commentary the fact that I love the sequence where Francis Byte transforms into Video Man. I loved it so much that, as a kid, I drew on a piece of paper the individual frames of Francis Byte becoming Video Man, as well as Bobby Drake transforming into Iceman. I paused the video and went frame by frame, and back then, you were never really getting a decent still image, but I did my best to make it work. And speaking of transformations, even though it's quite a simplistic transformation, I always did like Angelica Jones turning into Firestar with the declaration, "Firestar." Meehan would do an admirable job with the transformation, but Toei Doga, in the 4 episodes they animated, always made it look far more striking, but that's Japanese animation for you. Always looking good. Oh, before I forget, I really should talk about what Marvel Productions had planned for Video Man. So, ever since their appearance in Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, especially in the episode The X-Men Adventure, the heads at Marvel Productions were really looking to have the X-Men star in their own animated series. Those same individuals believed that Video Man would be a good addition to the team, as he not only tapped into the then modern market of video games, but also as a young character we would see the X-Men cast through his eyes. By the time the pilot had been produced, Kitty Pryde assumed the role of the young character joining the X-Men, and Video Man was pretty much forgotten about. I always love how Margaret Loesch and those that were pushing for an X-Men cartoon series finally got their wish in 1992 with the very successful X-Men cartoon, which capitalised on the incredible popularity of the X-Men comics at the time. Oh, and in this scene, Spider-Man claims that the crowd has now grown to 300,000. What the heck? And now the gamesman is going to have the 300,000 people gathered in Central Park attack the Spider-Friends. And in the foreground here we can see that one particular cell painter really wants to continue to have Bobby Drake appear in the episode. Act 1 ends here with, as Firestar puts it, 300,000 against 3. and then we see a wide angle with a few hundred people at most. I'm not sure why the spider friends are so panicked here. One can fly, one can use his spider-like abilities to leap up and swing away, and the other can create an ice bridge to safely escape the situation, but they're just going to stand in place for a while, seemingly for dramatic purposes. And what the heck is going on here? Which news crew are filming Louise and the crowd from this angle? I do like the way Louise seems to be the leader of the brainwashed mob now. And hey, the spider friends do eventually get out of harm's way. Sure took you long enough. You know, I'd love to find out who designed Iceman's method of travel. I always thought that it was incredibly creative. If you know the answer, please let me know. There's a fantastic scene coming up here. Firestar and Iceman attempt to aid Spidey at the same time, thus cancelling one another's help out. It's a great little gag and shows that they're not always the perfect team. And here's a scene I hinted at earlier, when Francis Bite demonstrates his ability to travel through TV screens and cables, but forgets to transform first, resulting in him headbutting the TV. And here he goes.
Oh, forgot to change first. Francis Bite, become
Video Man. And I'll bet the design of Video Man is lost on anyone born in the late 80s and early 90s. Like, why does he look all square? Completely unaware that video game sprites, especially in the very early 80s, were very limited with regards to pixels, and so Video Man is a wonderful representation of that. Look, I get that I'm being somewhat unfair to criticise the animation studio's inability to showcase 300,000 people, but as Spidey swings away here, we can see so much space in Central Park. He's pretty much safe wherever he swings to, but the dialogue and staging is clearly written that he's utterly surrounded at all times, and we can see that that is never the case. And here's Video Man again. I do like all of his dialogue. Francis Bite trying to speak like a superhero but failing in his delivery.
Can't you tell a superhero when you see one?
I have to say that he has adapted to his powers pretty fast, as we can see. He knocks down Spidey, destroys Iceman's wall, and takes Louise out of harm's way with great ease, which gives the goofy looking gamesman an idea. Yeah, I'm past hiding from how much I dislike the gamesman.
You've just been rescued by Video Man. You're safe here. I have to go back and save everybody else now. That's what we superheroes do. It's our mission in life.
One of the things I do like is that they play Video Man for laughs. The close-ups of the character, hearing Francis Bite's voice come out of him with no vocal processing or anything, is part of the charm of the character. There's a real innocence to him that I believe would be lost if he were to speak with a robotic computer-like voice. And yeah, the gamesman zips away, stopping the mind control, saying that he has now proven his point. Now get ready for this, we're going to get an amazing, and I use the term sarcastically, bird's eye view of the Spider Friends and Video Man as he claims he'll save his new allies from the mob. And we see 8 people, yes 8, not exactly 300,000. But it's funny nonetheless to see Francis as Video Man doing his best to do good and failing each and every time, seemingly causing disaster after disaster, even if his heart is in the right place. There's a bit coming up with Video Man looking for Louise. Again, Francis' squeaky voice coming forth from this giant video game creature is simply hilarious.
You're messing up everything.
Oh, yeah? I saved Louise. Louise? Louise! He's got Louise!
Louise? Louise? I'm not quite sure why here, but it appears that Francis suddenly loses all of his power. Now as himself, he has a little conversation with the Spider Friends, and I'll admit I always laugh at how awkward and cocky he is, like he has no social skills whatsoever. After Firestar pleads with him not to do anything, listen to his response to the group. I like the body language and direction of this scene. Francis Bite biting his nails, one hand in his pocket. It's an interesting visual.
Don't try and find the gamesman.
Leave it to the pros.
Sure. When do they get here?
Francis.
That's great, especially Iceman's Francis. Ah yes, the old crossing of the fingers. Now, the gamesman's lair here kind of seems inspired by the Griffith Park Observatory in Los Angeles, although this base of operations makes me laugh. How in the world did he build this and no law or government officials took notice of something so monumental? On the interior shots of his base of operations, be sure to look at the video game screen playing Pac-Man on a white background. Very interesting, especially given that there was a Hanna-Barbera Pac-Man cartoon at the same time. We're about to see Bobby Drake turn into Iceman. This version of the transformation was an alternate take on the sequence used in a few episodes. It's less dynamic than the main one, but it still looks good. Oddly, even though I hadn't seen Amazing Friends in close to 20 years, I always remembered Angelica Jones turning into Firestar and immediately saying, "Peter?"
Firestar. Peter?
So yeah, Peter Parker is going to remain at home and do some high-tech research on the supercomputer built by Tony Stark. And you thought that Tony Stark having a working relationship with Spider-Man was something created by the much celebrated MCU, or in 2024 should that be the once celebrated MCU? It's kind of weird to see Francis Bite back at the arcade. With everything going on, you'd think it would make more sense to have him back at his home trying to figure out what to do next. At this point we know that to make the transformation happen, Francis Bite has to command Francis Bite become Video Man. Not exactly by the power of Grayskull or Thundercats Ho, but it works for the dorkiness of the character.
Right back to their source.
Accompanying that Stanley narration, the shots of Video Man traversing the cables and chipsets is really nicely done. A wonderful level of detail and some rather fine angles depicting Video Man's journey. This Gamesman, I mean, I think I would have preferred it had he not worn a mask. It's such a silly design. And I understand that we have silly designs up the wazoo in the world of superheroes and supervillains, but it just doesn't look striking enough. Heck, maybe it's meant to look a little hurried given that we've never seen or heard of this guy before. But yeah, the Gamesman assumes so much about Francis here. Just because Video Man can traverse wires and chipsets, he expects that Video Man can enter a satellite communications centre and link the controls directly into the Gamesman's transmission unit. The first question from Francis should be, "Charlie, what now? How?" The Gamesman then reveals his true plan. With the satellite communications centre at his control, he'll be able to control the world by brainwashing all of those watching their television sets. Okay, this is a good plan, but I kind of wish we'd learned of the world domination plans earlier, as it feels somewhat tacked on here.
Look at them! Thousands of hypnotized teenagers controlled by the Gamesman.
Stanley's narration, it's interesting. Thousands of hypnotized teenagers. You do wonder if the writer Dennis Marks was making a comment on the huge influence and impact video games were having on the youngsters and society itself back in the early 80s. And it does appear that fire is a surefire, excuse the pun, way to stop people being hypnotized. I'm not sure how, with a beeping on the computer screen, Peter Parker is able to deduce that Video Man is out on the loose again. We get a good shot here of something that I don't think many people realise about the design of the Spider-Man costume in this series. The mask is depicted as a hood of sorts, in that it's attached to the rest of the costume so that Peter can just pull it back and let it hang, as we have seen in more than a few episodes of Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. It's nice to see Spider-Man giving Video Man advice because, as we know from his storied comic book career, he's been doing this for quite a while. That said, by the time the 1990s came around, Spidey faces a whole slew of new challenges. The Clone Saga, anyone? This part always makes me chuckle. Spider-Man strikes a deal with Video Man, but part of that deal is to have Video Man simply reside at Aunt May's home. I think a lovely little scene would have been to have Video Man and Aunt May interact and get on just fine, like Aunt May isn't remotely fazed by a giant video game creature. It always made me smile when Iceman would create his ice bridge and Spidey would hold on to him. In some episodes he would web himself to Iceman as he couldn't stand his sub-zero temperatures.
And now the end game begins.
I love this little quiet "go for it" that the Spider-Friends perform.
Go for it!
And this scene is somewhat infamous. Spider-Man's spider sense goes off and Iceman actually points out that it's glowing. Not sure why this was done because writer Dennis Marks definitely knew that in the comic books the light around Spider-Man's head was just a visual cue that his spider sense was active, not something that everyone else could see. And of course, because this is a video game themed episode, we get the trope that the heroes find themselves in a real life video game of sorts. We saw it in the original Video Man episode, in the Origin of the Iceman episode too, and I get it as a story element, but you'd think at this point in the episode we'd start wrapping up, engaging with the bad guy head on, exchanging a few quips, and seeing Francis Bite learn how to be a better hero, or what it takes to be a superhero. This all seems very much like an annoying distraction, well at least to this fan of 1980s cartoons anyway. And now we get the Pac-Man inspired piranha fish, which is actually rather amusing. Going back to how Iceman and Firestar have been put out of action, the idea of fire and ice being their respective weaknesses, it's amazing that the series didn't play into this story trope a lot more, because it's the most obvious way to take either or both of them out of a battle. This may be the only scene of the gamesman I like in the entire episode, but I still cannot stand his costume. After Video Man has delivered his speech saying that he has done what the villain asked of him, the gamesman pauses before delivering this scathing line.
You can put the entire world in a trance if you like, but first, let Louise go.
Yes, yes, of course. All in good time. You pathetic fool.
Pat Fraley delivers that line with such venom, it's perfect. It's odd that the gamesman traps Video Man, only for him to immediately escape into a screen in order to help Spidey. This exchange coming up makes me chuckle because I feel that Francis Bite is also asking Dennis Marks if he has a hot and cold ray.
Hit my buddies down there with a hot and cold ray.
I don't have a hot and cold ray.
You ever tried?
And then he just does. I mean, how does that even make sense? A video game creature that can traverse televisions and circuits, that I can accept. But now he can generate hot and cold temperatures? And now my favourite music cue kicks in. My buddy Dusan Mitrovic years and years ago kindly isolated this track for me, along with many other instrumentals from Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends and The Incredible Hulk.
If Video Man were here now, you'd be in real trouble.
But he isn't.
And look how quick the gamesman is defeated, it's ludicrously easy. And just as easy is Video Man restoring everything to the way it was. Now that was some wrapping up of a story. An amusing little moment here of Louise kissing Francis and getting a charge off him. Now I remember as a kid, as a fan of Secret Wars and thus the X-Men, seeing this next scene blew my mind. Yeah, we've seen cameos of the cast before and the episode A Firestar Is Born is X-Men heavy, but this moment was still so unexpected. And it goes back to what I was talking about earlier. There was a real consideration to have Video Man be a part of an animated X-Men cartoon. That would have been so interesting. And honestly, I think it would have worked. And so yeah, the education of a superhero. It's an episode that I have very fond memories of, although you can tell via this episode commentary that I find numerous faults with the script. That said, I believe that this episode has more charm than most. We really feel ourselves getting behind old Francis Bite. What kid doesn't want to be a superhero? But yeah, the story has a few too many diversions, especially visually. 300,000 people? I'll never get over that, clearly. And that's the end of this episode commentary. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to like, share and subscribe, and I'll catch you on the next one.